I've had at least two instances that I can think of on my own where I was a teenager and I was a law-abiding citizen. I was a good kid, and I've been pulled over by police. One of the times that I was pulled over by police was right around the time of the Central Park jogger. Well, sitting on the bench for me was the one mistake that I made that day.
Mm,
Um, while I was sitting there, I don't remember how long it was after my friends left, but I remember watching them walk off until I couldn't see them anymore.
mm.
And then it was not too long after that, a police car pulled up in front of me.
Believe it's over. You feel pushed aside, perhaps overlooked for a youthful mind. You're released to shine. Those incarcerated, believing life's unkind. Your mistakes are a thing of the past. Just have a clearer mind. Believe in yourself. Knowledge and wisdom. It's not about your age, but attitude. Believe in yourself. Knowledge and wisdom. You're released to shine. Believe in yourself. Knowledge and wisdom. It's not about the charge nor what you've done.
Welcome to another episode of the Release the Shine podcast. In 1989, five young boys were arrested: Corey Wise, Kevin Richardson, Raymond Santana, Antron McCrae, and Yusuf Salam. My co host will join us and we will be sharing with you what the Central Park 5 is all about. Welcome, my co host. How are you today?
I am well. How are you?
I am well, a
Or
little
yeah,
chilly.
yes, yes.
And how are you?
I'm well as well. I think it is certainly some type of sweater season or cover up season, whether it's scarf, hoodie, you name it. It's
Yeah.
it's definitely cold weather season. So, but I'm doing well nonetheless. Thank you.
Yes. All righty. We're talking about the Central Park 5.
Yes, and what's interesting about the Central Park Five. I learned in my studies, just as an undergraduate college student, I took a course in social studies where there was a distinction between primary and secondary sources. And so the reason why I bring that up is you happen to have a guest on the Release to Shine podcast who is a secondary source, not a primary source of the incidences and times of the Central Park Five. I am a former resident of New York City and the borough of Manhattan. Boroughs are synonymous with counties in other states around the United States. But in the borough of Manhattan, there is a famous, world famous park called the Central Park or Central Park itself. And the Central Park Five are five, at the time, teenage youth who were wrongly accused, convicted, and sentenced to time behind bars, if you will, or incarceration for a crime that they did not commit and were ultimately exonerated of.
Mm,
And as a secondary source of that, I remember being a teenager in New York City. I am probably right around the ages that they were, or I was around the ages that they were at the time they were arrested for the crime that happened, where a Central Park jogger was assaulted and beaten and raped and left for dead, and by far a very horrendous crime. But these five that were arrested, while they were in the park at the time, they were not the ones who committed the crime. And it's a very compelling story. But it was also a scary time as an African American teenager growing up in New York City, realizing that you could be pulled over by the police whether you uh, did anything or not. And it was an awful time for sure, but certainly that's not to condone what atrocities happened to the Central Park jogger that was raped and beaten and left for dead. There were quite a few wrong things that happened that evening back in April of 1989. But yes, sad set of circumstances all around. The Central Park jogger was Patricia Melly. Just going off of memory and some of the information I have in front of me, she went for a jog at some point that evening in late April 1989, was sexually assaulted and beaten unconscious and left for dead. In the same instance, there were about 30 teenage boys that entered New York City's Central Park, and they were causing trouble, just remembering New York City lingo or vernacular of the time. They were wilding out. And that term has been taken in and out of context. But just seeing it, being able to see it from both sides. As a teenager, wilding out was known to be having fun, and I'm speaking from one person's opinion. I can't speak for all Black teenage youth in New York City at that time, but wilding out was having fun, just having a good time. I will say, to give that even more fair context, there were a group of 30 of them having fun. Could have meant like just causing trouble and robbing people and
Okay.
things of that nature. It was later discovered that they did not commit this crime of beating and sexually assaulting this particular person, this woman who was jogging in the park. The New York City Police Department was under extreme pressure to find and convict people responsible for this crime. So, because they were in that place at that time, the translation of them being guilty, and it was later determined that they did not commit the crimes they were accused of.
The Central
Mhm.
Park Five. Were they a part of
Um,
a group of 30?
I'm not sure. I remember watching a documentary to speak specifically. One of the Central Park Five, his name is Raymond Santana. I don't remember how much time he spent in prison, but during his prison stint, somehow he found out the actual person who did commit the crime in the park.
He spent 5 years in prison.
Yes.
Mhm.
So during his time in prison, it was determined that there was one person who was responsible for the beating and rape of the
Mm,
Central Park jogger. And that one person was not associated with the group of the 30 teenagers
mm.
that were in Central Park that night. And I wish I remember the particular documentary that I watched, but that's part of the process to how all of them were exonerated eventually because of this discovery. And I'm not sure how it came to fruition that this one person was associated or linked to that particular crime as opposed to the Central Park Five.
These families were severely impacted. Do
Yes.
you have any information on the impact that this had on the specific families?
No, actually, I am the same age of these 5 that were incarcerated or justice or system impacted by this unfortunate set of circumstances, but I don't have any direct connection to any of the 5 that were involved or their families. It's a very scary thing when you are a parent who has a child who is not guilty and you know your child. Granted, when teenagers hang out in that capacity, there's probably anything could happen to where they could be blamed or accused or get in trouble for set of circumstances. But it's a very scary thing for families as well to encounter that. I'm also aware of, just through documentaries and what have you, the deliberate approach of parents trying to contact police departments in New York City for more information about where their children are, and they're not being told the truth as far as what's going on, and these kids are being interrogated, and prosecution is just adamant about making sure that they have a case against these kids whether they did it or not. I've watched some of the interrogations. There's one that I remember of Corey Wise. He was being interrogated, and he just talked about how he wanted to go home, and that was pretty much the
Mm.
sentiment of all of them, how they wanted to go home, and they were interrogated for multiple hours without any break,
Their parents.
without their parents, without legal
Really?
representation, um, and they were coerced into saying that they did it. I remember there were points in some of the interrogation where some of them developed this sort of sense of like they just gave up on, trying to convince the cops that they didn't do it, and they figured, okay, if I tell them I do it, then they'll maybe take it easier on me, okay, and I just give them what they want. But that was the worst that they could do, but they didn't have their parents representing them or covering them or legal representation, and so it just created a whirlwind of circumstances that did not work in their favor.
There are some implications here for parents and for the society at large. I grew up in the Caribbean, Jamaica. My mother always said idleness should be a crime.
Mm. Hmm.
Because when you're idle, you can get yourself caught up in a situation that you have no business in.
Hmm.
You're innocent, but you're going to be accused because of the idleness. And I'm hearing from you talking about these 30 young people who were just wasting time and idling and doing
Hmm.
foolishness. And that's idleness. And parents, please guide your little ones to find something to do. Read a
Oh yeah.
book. Read a book. Care for another sibling. Get involved by helping somewhere, a children's home. Do something that makes sense. But all of this nonsense created what happened. I know that some people are going to be angry at me for that. But idleness is a problem. Recently, I had a discussion with my children at church. I teach the youth group at my church.
Hmm.
And we were talking about the rise and fall, the rise and fall of David, King David.
Hmm.
And I said to them that David was idle. He was idle when he was looking at that woman taking a bath, Bathsheba.
Actually,
Idleness, yes. And it led to adultery and murder, all because he was idle. I empathize with these children and their and no young men and their families for what
Mhm.
happened. But I'm saying, parents, take a lesson from this and help your children to refocus. This is 2024. Young people need to find books to read. They are not reading enough.
Just to be very transparent about me, using myself as an example, I was born and raised in New York City.
Mm,
Uh, to develop more street credibility, I like to say I'm from Harlem, but I'm actually from the Upper West Side, which is, not to stick up my own nose, but is a little more affluent per se. Although, there are as much development in Harlem since I since I was a young person. But I didn't read my first book cover to cover, and maybe this is not something that I don't want to say I'm not proud of it, but
mm,
I just didn't develop a love for reading until I was exposed to books that made sense to me.
mm,
And I can't speak for everyone, but
mm,
maybe there are books that are pushed and promoted in schools that are sort of traditional books, like The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer and stuff like that. I grew up in Harlem, so the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer are far removed from any experience that I ever had growing up as a youth. I didn't read my first book cover to cover
mm,
until I was in the 11th grade in high school. And the name of the book was Native Son by Richard Wright. I love that book and it just captivated me. Just going back to even the Central Park Five and to what my colleague has said, that children should not be idle. I think, just knowing the circumstances of some parents growing up in New York City, parents had to work.
mm,
Maybe they didn't have that time to spend at home. And so they had children who were maybe home alone or allowed to roam the streets or whatever. My
mm,
parents gave me the freedom to go outside, things of that nature. But I had a village in my community. There's a gentleman that I grew up with, and my mom would ask him to look out for me whenever he could see me in his line of sight. My mom asked him to keep an eye out for me, and my parents restricted my movement to where she knew he would be during the day if I
mm.
was outside. So I was only allowed to, or mainly allowed to hang out in that area.
Okay.
And so she would pass by his apartment building every day, talk to him, socialize with him, and he would fill him in. One time I tried to open up a fire hydrant. New York City is big for kids opening fire hydrants in the
Oh
summertime
my
and
word.
having the fire hydrants run water and waste water. But that was our form of entertainment, playing in the fire hydrant. And my father, God bless his soul, he was an auto mechanic and he had tools at home. So I forget the name of the tool, but it was a tool that I could use to open up the fire hydrant with.
Mhm,
And I remember going outside and taking that tool. Nobody was outside but me. And so I'm starting to work the tool on the top of the fire hydrant, and then Mr. Frank is the gentleman in the community who would watch. I don't remember his nationality, but he had an accent, and I can remember him saying "Elliott," and that's all I needed to hear, and I was done. He's like, "What are you doing?" And I was done. In my childhood, I had people watching over me even when I didn't want them to.
mm,
Times have changed, things have changed, but whatever is appropriate for now is what parents need to do to make sure that their children are being looked over, monitored, and making sure they stay out of trouble. This occurrence happened with 30 teenagers roaming Central Park at 9 o'clock at night. we used to have a commercial on the news channels
Mm-hmm.
that say, it's 9 o'clock or it's 10 o'clock. Do you know where your children are? That commercial was like a wake up call. If you were a parent, shame on you if you didn't know where your kids were at 9 and 10 o'clock at night. You can't define good parenting as this, but certainly you can pull in various resources to be able to say, okay, I did this, I've done everything, and I won't stop at trying to figure out what I need to do to make sure that my children are safe and secure.
Right. You confirmed that it takes a village to raise a child
Absolutely.
because your family, your mother, trusted the neighbor to
Hmm.
look out for you, and all you had to do was to hear his voice.
Hmm. Yep.
My mother knew
Absolutely.
what time my school ended. No, I'm not the only child. There are several
Hmm.
in the family. So she knew the time when school ended and what time we should get home. If we're going to the library, we had to let her know from in the morning that we're going. We can't just go.
Yep.
She had to know that because she knew what time we should be home, and that would be a problem. Now, this situation, apart from these children being out there playing unsupervised, and I'm sure the family knew they were mischievous.
Hmm.
No, there is no reason for the police to have taken them into custody and interrogate them without their parents and their attorney. That was wrong. There was no
But
adult. The police should never be speaking to the children like
I,
that. I don't agree with that. That was
I,
not good.
I totally agree with you, and I'm sorry to interject, uh,
Mhm.
but the climate of law enforcement at that time in New York City, the time period and the tactics of law enforcement back in that late 80s, early 90s New York City was one that was arguable with Gestapo tactics
Wow.
of German Nazi regime, if you will. It was horrible. I can't speak to how it is now. I'm sure it has changed from them, but the idea of law enforcement taking into custody teenagers without representation or parent protection, if you will, is not surprising to me at all. It was actually commonplace. I've had at least two instances that I can think of on my own where I was a teenager and I was a law abiding citizen. I was a good kid, and I've been pulled over by police. One of the times that I was pulled over by police was right around the time of the Central Park jogger. I remember it was a Wednesday, and I only remember it was a Wednesday because we had half days at my junior high school on Wednesday. So I was out of school early. I was out of school maybe around 12 or 1 o'clock. I lived within walking distance of my junior high school back in New York City. And I had two friends who they walked with me to my apartment building. And my apartment building is it was right in front of Central Park. I lived across the street from Central Park growing up. So that day my friends they asked me if I wanted to walk with them to Harlem, towards Harlem, to hang out with them because we had gotten home from school. And I had a headache. And I said, no, you guys go ahead. I'm just going to sit on the bench for a little while. And then I'm going to go upstairs to my apartment building. Well, sitting on the bench for me was the one mistake that I made that day.
Mm.
Um, while I was sitting there, I don't remember how long it was after my friends left, but I remember watching them walk off until I couldn't see them anymore. And
Mhm.
then it was not too long after that, a police car pulled up in front of me and they start asking me questions like, why am I sitting on the bench? Why am I there? And I let them know I just got out of school. It was a half a day. And while I'm talking to them, I'm not sure how long it was, but next thing I look up, it was their police car. There were three other police cars, and then there was one police van. It was like a Chevy 5000, I forget the model, but they were like it was a 15 passenger van that pulled up in front of me and surrounded me. And this was all in a matter of minutes of me having this initial conversation with the two police officers that confronted me. I lived on the fifth floor of my building, and I had a neighbor who witnessed the police confronting me. Fortunately, she was there. And I'm not sure if she was an attorney. She said to them, why are you questioning this young man? She confronted them. She was
Mhm.
like, he will not say anything else, and I'm his attorney. She went into protection mode because she knew me, and she wasn't my mother or father, but certainly um, I thank the Lord for her being in that place in that time.
Mhm.
So eventually, there was a car that pulled up, and I think there were two officers in the car, and I remember one white female being in the back seat. They pulled up, and I think it was the kind of thing where she was trying to identify me, and then she shook her head as if to say, no, that's not him. Now, this was separate from the Central Park jogger scenario. I think it happened shortly after
Mhm.
that situation.
Mhm.
But thank the Lord, number one, that I was innocent.
Mhm.
And number two, that the lady did not give a positive ID. you know, praise God. But that was my circumstances. And once she said no, it's like these cops, they disbanded with no apology, no, no consolation prize, no handshake, no high five, nothing. They just disbanded and it was quiet again. So
Frightening. Frightening for you.
I didn't realize how frightening it was until much after the fact. In the scenario, I was more shell shocked, and you know, I'm a person who tends to tell the truth, whether it's to my detriment or not, and I've always been that way. I was telling them the truth. I only imagine that these five youth, Central Park Five, were telling the truth, but because they didn't have the representation, the legal representation or the protection of their parents speaking on their behalf, the law enforcement of that time were allowed to prey on these kids. They were allowed to prey on these kids and just set them on a course for a life that they did not expect or predict or call upon themselves for any reason whatsoever. So,
And exhaustion, sorry to have cut in, but
mhm.
exhaustion may have caused them to
Oh,
give in
absolutely.
because they were tired. I mean, you're being
Absolutely.
interrogated by law enforcement. First of all, that is one scary thing, to be questioned by law enforcement when you know you have done nothing wrong. So that's one thing, it's scary. And then you are looking forward to going home.
For sure.
Who you're thinking, I'm going to get into trouble with my parents. I need to get home.
Hmm. Yeah.
And then you are there without any kind of adult representation.
Right.
It is extremely wrong. And those laws,
Illegal.
extreme. How do
Mm.
you do that to these children?
Yep.
How,
Yep.
and some of those police must have been parents.
What they did was unconscionable. It was immoral. The way law enforcement works, you have the law enforcement police, but you also have the legal entities, the prosecutors and district attorneys. those law enforcement are getting pressure from the prosecutorial entities
Mhm.
to coerce statements or get these youth to say things that would incriminate them, whether they know it or not. I blame law enforcement as well as prosecution and state's attorney's office of the time for what these young men endured by far. It should
Mhm.
not have happened. Whether you're talking about the young men or respectfully, even the Central Park jogger herself, I don't condone sexual crimes of that nature. She too was in the wrong place at the wrong time by
Mhm.
far.
Mhm.
And it's unfortunate what happened to her as well, but it's just a travesty all around.
So these five gentlemen are no advocate for criminal justice reform.
Yes.
And I am happy that out of their pain, out of that atrocity, they are able to turn their lives around and
Yes.
to become useful contributors to our society. Yusef,
I know he's in some type of political office. I think it's like a city council role.
okay, yeah. But these young men were sentenced to 5 to 10 years. One person served 12 years,
Mhm.
and they are now contributors to our society in the area of criminal justice reform. Out of
Mhm.
evil cometh forth good. And we
Yeah.
trust that as individuals like us continue to get ourselves involved in the criminal justice reform, because Elliot and I are also a part of that. We're playing our part in helping with criminal justice reform. I trust that more persons will get involved. Do your research and get involved in this cause. This is a worthy cause. I became interested in helping with this process because a student of mine sent me a card, a beautiful card, and a letter from, from a jail.
Mhm.
And it stirred everything within me to get on board. And this is a part, just a part, a small part of my contribution to criminal justice reform. As you continue to follow this podcast, I will reveal more of what I do in this area. But I want to thank you for listening. And I pray that our discussion will stir something within you to get involved. Elliot, you can have your last words for this evening, for this podcast.
Oh, well, I I thank you, Megan, for the time and the opportunity to speak on a time in our country's history and a time from of personal relevance for me, just based on my circumstances, memory, and upbringing. The Central Park Five, it's an incredibly frustrating ordeal to know in your heart of hearts that you're telling the truth about a set of circumstances. And despite how much you tell the truth, you're not believed for whatever reasons, and you are effectively silenced for a season because of those circumstances. But I think part of the purpose of this podcast is to encourage those that even if you go through a set of circumstances or a travesty of some sort, the name of this podcast is Released to Shine. So there's an expectation that ultimately that that you will evolve and be able to rise from some significantly negative circumstances and do wonderful and great things for many people. So let this podcast, let this episode serve as an encouragement for you to continue to practice altruism and great works for people without the expectation of anything in return, no matter what the circumstances, and you will be blessed beyond measure. So, and I thank you, colleague, for allowing me the opportunity to come on and share in this capacity.
It's an honor to have you, my friend. I trust we will be doing this together for a long time. And
Yes.
to our viewers, to our community, if you were released from a job or a prison, you were released to shine. Remember that. And just believe in yourself and the skills and the experiences that you have. Put them to good use. Blessings.